I'm Turner, student of Southern New Hampshire University, and I am about to deliver my information speech. This is titled Finding Prosperity. There is nothing on this earth more important than family and success. It is obvious that people will generally have separate viewpoints and perspectives on this topic based on life circumstances. To define family and success, one would have to consider the different nationalities, cultures, religious beliefs, social, and core values we as humans live by in our duration of life. It is common with most Americans and other cultures that health, education, safety, and happiness all leads to a successful family. Security, intelligence, trust, and confidence, it all falls under the umbrella of family and success as well. Reading from an online article called Family IQ, writer Susan Duffy opened the article with this note, and I quote, "Value is defined as the quality or worth of a thing. To combine the words together yields a definition of a traditional set of social standards defined by the family and history of customs that provide the emotional and physical basis for raising family. Our social values are oftentimes reinforced by our spiritual and religious beliefs and traditions," unquote. But before we can measure or define any level of family success, we must first understand the narrative. History tells a story about a time in America during the Great Depression of the 1930s through the 1940s, when education and economic growth for Americans had its limits, mostly due to World War I. In a book published in 1958 called The Affluent Society, written by John Kenneth Galbraith, in his book, John talked about the poverty that existed in the United States and around the world after the Cold War. He said, and I quote, "No one would wish to argue that the ideas which interpreted this world of grim scarcity would serve equally well for the contemporary United States. Poverty was an all-pervasive fact of the world," unquote. Things had eventually began to turn for the better after the Cold War. Writer Jerry D. Marks, who has a PhD in social studies from the University of New Hampshire, Jerry wrote an article called American Social Policy in the 1960s and 1970s. He stated in the opening paragraph of this article, "As the decade of the 1960s began, the United States had the highest mass standard of living in world history. The strong American post-war economy of the late 1940s and 1950s continued into the 1960s. In fact, from 1940 to 1960, the U.S. gross national product increased fivefold. After the Cold War, economic structure, domestic and foreign trade was at its all-time high. Education, jobs, and industry began to take shape in America. However, there was still a good number of Americans left in poverty. It wasn't until 1964 when President Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty in his State of the Union address. President Johnson set into motion the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, opening the door to federal work-study programs, Social Security reform, which from that created Medicaid and Medicare for some Americans. The food stamp program also went into effect in 1964, along with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was signed into law in 1965. Because of these new laws executed by President Johnson, it set a new path of opportunity for Americans to recover and build from. Dylan Matthews is a writer from the Washington Post. He wrote a column titled Everything You Need to Know About the War on Poverty. In his column, Dylan mentioned an economist at Columbia University who gave a breakdown of poverty change from 1967 to 2012. He showed in his graph that from 1967 to 2012, poverty was down considerably from 26% to 16%. During this 45-year span, the value of the dollar went from $1.08 in the 1960s to $6.85 in 2012. The American economy was growing, and families across the U.S. and abroad were benefiting from this surge and inflation. Being 48 years of age, I can say that I grew up in a time when social struggles infested cities across America. Jersey City, New Jersey was the town I grew up in during the 1970s into the 1980s. The basic family income for most people in my town was welfare and food stamps. Jobs and opportunity was not something many people talked about because there was none. Welfare checks and food stamps came once a month, so parents had to buy enough food to feed their families for at least 30 days. This process continued 12 months in a year. Some of the families were very large families. I knew families that consisted of 6 people living in a 3-bedroom apartment because during that time, the more kids you had, the higher your welfare check would increase. Many families saw this as a way of financial gain, so they would have as many kids as they could. It was a time of hopelessness and depression or desperation with no direction. Jobs were hard to find. The minimum wage in those days were $5 per hour. People did not want to work in factories because you had to work very long hours for low wage. However, factory jobs were the only jobs around, and many of those jobs were like sweatshops and full of workplace politics. And in many cases, you were treated like a slave. The words future and goals were words never talked about where I grew up. No one ever asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? When I think back now, it was so disheartening to have grown up that way. There was no sense of empowerment at home or throughout the community. Very few of us had family members who endorsed planning, encouragement, guidance, or support. The reason being, they themselves had been tied up in the system for so long, without education, direction, or opportunity, it was all they knew. There was simply no groundwork for families in my community and some communities across the U.S. to build on future success. During the 1980s, people began thinking about themselves more. Ronald Reagan had become president, and in his first term as president, Reagan cut taxes, which gave Americans a new sense of hope. People began venturing out to establish and build their own success. Many saw a new wave of opportunity because of the changes Reagan implemented during his first term as president. I can remember people talking about school, setting goals, expressing the need for financial freedom. Many people in those days dropped out of high school with no high school diploma. But as times changed for the better, the general public started talking about the GED test. Getting a GED was the way to new opportunities and or college admission. The GED certificate was the vehicle to a better life. People were motivated in the 80s. Learning a new skill or trade had become very popular. If you had some kind of skill set, whether it be technical, filing or sorting, answering phones, or anything mechanical, your chances of making a good living was doubled. It was an exciting time to set a new course in life. People would ask friends and family members that did have a decent job, what do you do? And how did you get that job? It was a sense of excitement and empowerment. People were sharing information about opportunity and how to achieve them. The civil rights movement of the 1960s helped to rekindle the women's movement of the 1970s. The 1980s was a time when women began their climb up the ladder of success. Temp agencies were very popular in those days. Many people sought temp agencies with the hope of landing permanent jobs. Women of the 80s took temp jobs as office assistants and secretaries. It was a time when women had become very ambitious and independent. They brought inspiration to men and women all over as they began the trend of raising a family, going to school, holding on to a full-time or part-time job, all at the same time. I was inspired by changing times as well. as a young man coming out of the inner city, I started with Xerox Corporation in 1983, working for a temporary agency myself. I worked temporary for 3 years with Xerox before I was hired full-time in 1986. In 1988, my first child was born. It was then I started to realize the importance of family and success. It was during those years I began to see more of my friends and family members put more focus towards education and financial stability. Everyone wanted a career. Career was a word never mentioned in the community I grew up in during the 70s. But during the mid-80s into the 90s, having a career was the focus for everyone. Speaking of the women's movement and their amazing success stories, Ursula Burns started with Xerox in 1980 as a mechanical engineer summer intern. She later took on roles as the project developer and planner. From 1992 to 2000, Burns, at a pivotal point in the company's history, led several business teams, including the Xerox Color business and Office Network printing business, as she was named VP of Xerox in 2000 and is currently the CEO of Xerox today. As an African American woman, Ursula's story is amazing. She accomplished this amazing story in a time when people of all colors were looking to make positive change and women were looking to change the status quo in business ownership and move up the corporate ladder. It is stories like Ursula's which show times have changed for all Americans. It also demonstrates how far we have come through exploration into the age of science, technology, and economic growth. It gives hope to people from all walks of life to say, with hard work, determination, ambition, and a little luck, I might add, you can achieve great wealth and success in this world we live in. Times have changed and they continue to change rapidly. The world that we live in today, opportunities are all around us. People in this country and abroad are motivated and determined more than ever to achieve success and provide better lives for themselves and their families. It is unreasonable for most people to believe that success can be reached by a single sprint, without having to cover the step-by-step journey it takes to reach an attainable goal. Our children grew up with family traditions and values we teach them. Some of us use family history and struggles related to that history to motivate and shape our kids to become model citizens. We tell our kids that goals that can be seen is a goal that can be achieved. We encourage and expect our kids to be better than we are, to embrace the changing times, and to educate yourself accordingly. We say to them, if you fail to reach your goal, do not stop until you get there. Life is a journey, but it is a path that must be traveled with many lessons along the way. We must learn from past history and realize that opportunities before us today also expect more from ourselves. We must get up each day with a purpose, maintain a strong work ethic, and keep an open mind to change. We must maintain discipline and persistence and keep a positive outlook as we move forward in life. In conclusion, we live in a day and age where any and everything is possible. Possible meaning a person or a thing that has the potential to become or do something. Potential being the key word. However, not every family is perfect, but perfection does not define family. Not every family is successful, but success does not define happiness. When you have health and happiness within your family circle, together you have a level of success which you can build from. You see, most of us are born with a special ability. Finding and putting that ability to good use will almost always give you a chance at finding prosperity. Thank you.